The Indian Air Force stands today as one of the fastest evolving air forces and ranks as the fourth largest by strength in the world. Its motto, Nabha Sparsham Deeptam, translates to touch the sky with glory. It captures the spirit that defines this institution. This reflects a blend of service, sacrifice, and excellence, shaped by military necessity and a broader philosophical undercurrents of a nation that emerged from a long struggle for independence. Like any institution with a long and evolving history, the Indian Air Force has also experienced its share of challenges and contested decisions. These moments have been scrutinized by analysts and experts alike, and they have contributed to an ongoing discourse about the Indian Air Force's capability, preparedness, and the strategic direction it is taking right now. However, such instances have not defined the force. Instead, they form part of a larger trajectory marked by adaptation, learning, and sustained operational relevance. Despite its prominence today, there remains a limited public understanding of how the Indian Air Force came into existence. Contemporary perceptions are often shaped by its current capabilities and operational stature, and they tend to obscure the harsh conditions under which it was originally conceived. In doing so, we often overlook the interplay of political considerations, institutional constraints, and strategic necessities that defined its formative years. A closer examination of this history, therefore, becomes necessary to reconstruct the context of the events in which they unfolded. It is within this narrative that we must separate the facts from fiction while honoring the struggles that went into the formation of the Indian Air Force. It also becomes imperative that our inquiries into the history of the Air Force are situated within the broader global context. By the early decades of the 20th century, air power had already begun to emerge as a defining element of modern warfare. Major powers had moved away from experimentation and were actively using aircrafts in combat while simultaneously developing doctrines that would integrate air power into their broader military strategy. In contrast, the Indian subcontinent had neither the infrastructure nor the intent to envision an air force of its own. There were no operational squadrons, no trained cadre of pilots, and no structured approach to aviation. More significantly, the very notion of India exercising control over its own air was viewed with clear reluctance, if not outright opposition, within the British administrative establishment. Within a relatively brief span of time, however, the situation has undergone a marked transformation. From a modest and carefully structured beginning, the Indian Air Force has evolved into a force capable of undertaking complex and sophisticated operations. Over the decades, it has built a reputation that carries both operational credibility and a certain degree of mystique. It has executed complex combat operations across diverse terrains, conducted precision missions in hostile environments, and delivered humanitarian assistance far beyond India's national borders. Yet, this trajectory of growth has not been without its underlying contradictions. The Indian Air Force was conceived within a colonial framework, and yet it would eventually emerge as a symbol of national capability and strategic autonomy. It began with limited resources and a narrowly prescribed role, but expanded over time into a multidimensional force with considerable operational reach. It is within these inherent contrasts that a deeper understanding of the institution must be located. To fully appreciate the Indian Air Force in its present form, it is necessary to return to its origins. This involves examining the political context of the time, the motivations of both the Indian leadership and the British administration, and the sequence of decisions that led to its establishment. Before aircrafts were inducted, before the pilots were commissioned, and before operational doctrines were formulated, there existed a fundamental question regarding the very necessity and nature of an air force in India. By the early 1910s, after nearly a century under British rule, India's position as a colony had resulted in sustained economic, political, and military constraints. The policies of the British administration were structured in a manner that systematically limited Indian participation in positions of authority and restricted any meaningful transfer of power to the indigenous population. The divergence between global developments and the Indian context was a direct consequence of this political structure within which India existed at the time. While air power was being actively integrated into national military strategies elsewhere, even in dominions like Australia and Canada, India's position as a colony relegated it to the outskirts of such discussions. As a result, India's military framework evolved as an extension of the British policy in India. Defense planning was designed around imperial interests and focused on maintaining control, securing trade routes, and managing volatile frontier regions, rather than fostering independent military capability within the subcontinent. In such a framework, there existed little immediate rationale for creation of a distinct Indian-controlled era. And yet, even within this infrastructure of restraint, the British perspective on air was undergoing a gradual shift. By the late 1910s, aviation had already assumed a critical role in imperial defense, and its application was no longer confined to the European theatres. For the British administration, the question was not whether air power should be introduced in India, but how it could be integrated in a manner that served imperial objectives, particularly in a region as strategically significant as British India. By 1915, this necessity had reached a critical point, leading to the deployment of No. 31 Squadron of the Royal Air Force to Nowshera in present day Pakistan. As British strategic requirements in the region intensified, No. 114 Squadron was subsequently introduced in 1917, and by 1918, the Royal Air Force had established a relatively significant presence in India, comprising approximately 80 officers and 600 personnel. This expansion was accompanied by growing recognition within the British administration of the potential utility of air power in the Indian context. In 1918, the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montague, advocated for a more effective use of aviation in the region. This prompted the India Office to press the Air Ministry in Britain to re-equip the RAF squadrons already stationed in India with aircrafts more suited to frontier operations. The Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2s then in service were increasingly considered inadequate for such roles, largely because of their limited performance, low speed, and vulnerability in hostile environments. These limitations reduced their effectiveness in reconnaissance as well as in offensive operations across the difficult terrain of northwest frontier. The India Office was also keen to reinforce the existing strength of RAF in India by reinforcing with additional squadrons. These proposals, however, could not be immediately realized. The ongoing demands of the First World War required the retention of aircrafts and trained personnel in primary theatres such as the Western and Italian fronts, as well as in Palestine. It was only after the armistice that the British Air Ministry renewed its interest in expanding the RAF deployment in India. This interest was driven not only by operational considerations, but also by administrative and financial logic. Squadrons stationed in India could function with comparatively lower grade equipment and maintenance standards, while the cost of sustaining them would be borne by the Government of India. This in turn allowed resources within Britain to be redirected towards strengthening the Royal Air Force at home. Despite this early advocacy, the defence of India continued to remain largely under the realm of the British Indian Army. Although the position of an air advisor was created within the Government of India, it remained unfilled until 1923. Meanwhile, the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army remained the sole advisor of the British administration in India on matters of defence, thus effectively confining the RAF to a largely supporting role. This structural limitation was also reflected in contemporary observations. In 1922, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir John Slessor, then a former flight commander with No. 20 Squadron, noted in his memoir, The Central Blue, that the RAF in India suffered far less from the malevolence of a tribal enemy than from the depredations of the Government of India. Across much of the empire, the RAF had already evolved into a separate and autonomous service with its own budget presented to a parliament by the dedicated Secretary of State. In India, however, the Air Force remained financially subordinated with its expenditure treated as a component of the army budget and was controlled by the Commander-in-Chief in his capacity as the army member of the Viceroy's Council. These institutional constraints, however, tell only part of the story. Outside the formal military framework, the first instances of Indian participation in military aviation had begun to emerge. Though small in scale and tightly restricted, these early efforts would prove significant and laid the groundwork for the eventual evolution of an indigenous air force in India. During the First World War, all officers of the Indian Army who served in aerial roles were of European origin. This reflected the broader exclusion of Indians from positions of command within the military hierarchy. In fact, prior to 1914, the War Office had maintained a strict policy of denying commissions to individuals who were not of purely European descent. This exclusion was based on the prevailing belief that British personnel would not accept leadership from half-caste and native Indian officers. The exigencies of war, however, led to a gradual relaxation of this position, and a small number of Indians did participate in the air war as officers of the Royal Flying Corps and of the Royal Air Force. In November 1916, Warrant Officer Cadet Evans became the first Anglo-Indian to be admitted to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. In the same month, Gigi-Boy Piroshaw Bowman Gigi Boy became the first Indian to enter the Royal Flying Corps, and received a commission in the General List of Duty with the Royal Flying Corps as a temporary honorary second lieutenant on 6 November 1916. Although his training was cut short due to ill health, leading to the relinquishment of his commission in 1917, his induction marked a significant precedent. He would go on to be the first among at least 5 Indians known to have served in the Royal Air Force. A key figure in facilitating this development was Brigadier General Sir Sefton Brancker. General Brancker actively supported the inclusions of Indians in the Royal Flying Corps and was himself responsible for training of 4 Indian cadets in 1916. Among them was Shri Krishna Chand Welingkar, a student of Jesus College, Cambridge, who applied for a temporary commission in the RFC on 22nd November 1916 and was personally recommended by Brancker for the officer's cadet wing. Welingkar was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant on probation in June of 1917 and was subsequently deployed to the Western Front during the First World War. While serving with No. 23 Squadron, he undertook an offensive patrol on the morning of 27 June 1918, taking off at 9:45 am. He failed to return from this mission, and his Soviet Dolphin was last observed heading east while engaged in combat with the German two-seater. Shot down behind enemy lines, Lieutenant Welingkar sustained fatal injuries and died approximately 3 days later, becoming one of the earliest Indian flying officers to lose his life in active service with the Royal Air Force. Errol Suvo Chandra Sen was also awarded a commission as a temporary honorary second lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps. On completing his training, he too was deployed on the Western Front. While serving with No. 70 Squadron, equipped with Sopwith Camels, he undertook an offensive patrol on the morning of 14 September 1917. During this mission, his aircraft suffered an engine failure, forcing him to land behind German lines. He was captured and remained a prisoner of war until he was repatriated to the UK on 14 December 1918 after the armistice. Lieutenant H.S. Malik, immortalized as the Flying Sikh, holds the distinction of being amongst the first Indian aviators to undertake combat operations over the skies of France. His exploits find mention not only alongside decorated figures such as Commander Barker, awardee of the Victorian Cross, but also within the pages of his own reflective autobiography, A Little Work, A Little Play. It was an era defined by individual daring and aggressive initiative, and in keeping with that spirit, Barker conceived an audacious low-level strike against the home aerodrome of Manfred van Richthofen, the fabled Red Baron. When he called for volunteers to accompany him, 3 pilots stepped forward. Among them was Lieutenant Malik. The conditions on the day of the mission were far from favorable. The October weather had turned harsh and unforgiving, with dense fog enveloping the landscape. Yet, Barker perceived the opportunity in adversity, believing the weather would lend both concealment and element of surprise. Shortly after takeoff, however, the formation began to fragment, 2 of the accompanying pilots losing visual contact in the haze. Only Malik remained steadfast, maintaining position with unwavering discipline, his focus fixed entirely on his leader's wingtip and the faint ghost-like silhouette of his camel aircraft cutting through the mist. Their approach did not go unnoticed. Barker and Malik were soon intercepted by a sizable formation of German fighters, and in the ensuing engagement, the two were separated, each forced into a desperate struggle for survival amidst the chaos of aerial combat. Malik demonstrated both skill and resolve, succeeded in forcing one enemy aircraft down, sending it spiraling out of control. But the odds remained heavily stacked against him. At least 4 German fighters continued the pursuit. Their gunfire was relentless. Bullets tore through his aircraft, puncturing the fuel tank beneath his seat and striking his leg, leaving him wounded and bleeding. Despite this mounting damage and the searing pain, Malik pressed on. Blood pooled within his flying boot as he struggled to regain control of his aircraft. His maneuverability had severely been limited, and his fuel system had been compromised. Unable to outpace his pursuers, he resorted to flying mere feet above the ground, skimming the terrain in a desperate bid for survival. It was then, through the haze of battle and injury, that he caught sight of a familiar landmark. With little choice remaining, Malik brought his battered aircraft down and crash landing along its shores, bringing an end to a harrowing yet remarkable episode of courage under fire. Perhaps the most widely recognized among these early Indian aviators was Lieutenant Indra Lal Roy. His application was personally referred by Brigadier General Brancker, and he was granted a commission on 26 March 1917. His early service with No. 56 Squadron was largely unremarkable. Furthermore, a flying accident in December of 1917 resulted in injuries that necessitated his withdrawal from active flying duties. He was temporarily assigned to ground responsibilities, And as he eventually recovered from his injuries, and after a refresher flying course, Roy was posted to Number 40 Squadron in June 1918. There, under the command of Captain George McElroy of Sea Flight, his performance underwent a notable transformation as he flew the SC-5A fighter over France. Under McElroy's tutelage, Roy emerged as a highly effective combat pilot, shooting down 9 enemy aircrafts within a span of just 13 days, thus becoming India's first and only flying ace. Sadly, Lieutenant Roy's impressive career was cut short when he failed to return from a sortie on 22nd July. Squadron reports indicate that his Royal Aircraft Factory SC-5A fighter was likely shot down in flames at 8:50 a.m. in combat with Fokkers near Cavan. In recognition of his actions, Lieutenant Indra Lal Roy was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation describing him as a very gallant and determined officer was published in the London Gazette on 21st September 1918. Together, Lieutenant Indra Lal Roy, Second Lieutenant Welingkar, Lieutenant H.S. Malik, Lieutenant Errol Sane, and Lieutenant Nauroji came to be known as the Magnificent Five. These early Indian aviators, serving under the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, rose above the rigid confines of their time, challenging the entrenched racial hierarchies even as they took to the skies. In the course of their service, three among them made the ultimate sacrifice, their lives claimed in the crucible of aerial combat. In the wake of early successes demonstrated by Indian aviators, General Brancker began to envision a more structured and deliberate program for recruiting Indian aviators. This was driven as much by necessity as by conviction in order to address the persistent shortfall in candidates for flying training. He is even recorded to have remarked that Indians would make excellent pilots, possessing both reliability and aptitude necessary for excellence in the air. However, tellingly, he qualified this confidence with the reservation when it came to their own homeland, as he quoted, Indians are quite trustworthy, except perhaps in their own country. This sentiment found quite resonance within sections of the India Office, where it was argued that Indians endowed with keen eyesight, disciplined habits, and composed temperament were naturally suited to the demands of aviation. Yet, just like General Branker's remark, such positive perspectives were in stark contrast to the deeply entrenched attitudes at the time. The Viceroy of India, Lord Chelmsford, remained firmly opposed. He was convinced that it would be untenable for British officers to serve alongside Indians in such intimate and hierarchical roles, particularly in scenarios where a British officer might be relegated to the role of an observer while an Indian pilot commanded the aircraft. Chelmsford's objections were not merely administrative but ideological. He dismissed Branker's proposal outright, justifying his stance with the revealing comparison that if Indians were not deemed fit to be entrusted with the artillery within the British Indian Army, it would be inconceivable to grant them control of an aircraft. By the time these objections were formally raised in 1919, the war had already drawn to a close. The urgency that had once driven India officers' interest in Indian recruitment had dissipated, and in the absence of any meaningful resistance, Chelmsford's position prevailed unchallenged. A parallel dynamic was already evident within the structure of the British Indian Army. It was an institution that formed the very backbone of the subcontinent's military apparatus, and it was this entrenched framework that shaped the role of Indians in air power as well. Although the officer corps of the British Indian Army, both prior to and during the First World War, comprised of British and Indian personnel alike, this coexistence was far from equitable. British officers held the King's Commission, placing them on an equal footing with their counterparts in the British Army, while Indian officers served under a more limited Viceroy's Commission. This arrangement imposed strict ceilings on their advancement, denying them promotion beyond regimental ranks and precluding any authority over British troops. By the time such disparities were formally acknowledged and debated within the Legislative Assembly, the British administration was acutely aware of the growing strain and dissatisfaction within this unequal system. It was within this broader context of institutional imbalance that the question of extending similar hierarchies into the emerging domain of air power began to surface. The experience of Army, with its rigidly stratified command structure, cast a long shadow over deliberations concerning the future of aviation in India, particularly in determining whether Indians could be entrusted with roles of operational and command responsibility. Meanwhile, the decisive impact of air warfare during the First World War had elevated aviation from a peripheral innovation to a central instrument of military strategy. The Royal Air Force's demonstrated effectiveness ensured that its employment in the Indian context, especially along the volatile border regions, became an increasingly significant subject of strategic decision and debate. Much of the early deliberations were shaped by the persistent challenges confronting the British military leadership along the northwest frontier province, a region that had long tested the limits of imperial control. For decades, the frontier had remained a theater of recurring instability. Tribal uprisings, coupled with protracted Anglo Afghan conflicts, had repeatedly exposed the inadequacies of conventional ground based operations. The unforgiving terrain imposed severe constraints, stretching supply lines thin and rendering sustained military presence both laborious and prohibitively expensive. Compounding these operational difficulties was the dual nature of the threat itself. Writing in February 1931 issue of the Journal of the Royal United Service Institution, Lieutenant General Sir George McMahon offered a measured reflection on the complexities of defending the northwest frontier. He observed that any such discussion must begin with the recognition that the challenge was not singular, but dual in nature, comprising what he described as a greater and a lesser problem. The former, in his view, concerned the defense of India's frontier against defined external incursions, while the latter addressed the persistent need to safeguard settled populations within the administrative boundaries from the incursions of tribal groups such as the Wazirs, Masoods, and Orakzais, who existed beyond the formal reach of the British authority. In the turbulent years of 1918 to 1920, it was the Royal Air Force that emerged as a decisive instrument in addressing both dimensions of this challenge, lending critical support to the Indian Army in a theatre where conventional approaches had repeatedly fallen short. It was against this backdrop of layered threats and operational constraints that air power began to assume a far more central and increasingly indispensable role in the frontier strategy. On 20th November 1918, the Air Ministry formally communicated to the India Office the outcome of what it described as a most careful review of India's prospective aerial requirements. The review covered both aspects in terms of aircraft intended to operate in close cooperation with ground forces and those constituting an independent long range striking capability. The assessment concluded that a force of 12 squadrons would be necessary, comprising of 4 corps of reconnaissance squadrons in the Army cooperation role, 2 fighter reconnaissance squadrons, 2 squadrons equipped with scouts or fighters, 2 day bomber units, and 2 squadrons of Giants, the heavy bombers of the era. This marked and sudden expansion in projected strength was driven largely by the growing apprehension of a potential Turco German offensive towards India through the northwest. Nonetheless, such an ambitious proposal was bound to be met with resistance at the highest levels. The Secretary of State remained reluctant to sanction what was perceived as an excessive financial burden, particularly in the context of post war constraints. What followed was a period of protracted deliberations and negotiations, at the end of which a significantly scaled down establishment was approved, limiting the Royal Air Force presence in India to 5 squadrons. By mid 1919, these units had reached operational strength and included Number 20 Squadron and its advanced elements, Number 48 Squadron equipped with Bristol fighters, and Number 99 Squadron operating the de Havilland DH-9A bombers. On the international stage, the events of 1919 Anglo-Afghan War proved decisive in underscoring the emerging significance of air power along India's northwest frontier. Over the course of the conflict, the Royal Air Force conducted sustained operations against Afghan forces and allied tribal elements across the entire expanse of the frontier, from Chitral in the northeast to Siastan in the southwest, spanning nearly 1,000 miles of unforgiving terrain. The RAF was no longer confined to reconnaissance in support of ground forces and assumed a far more assertive role. Squadron number 31 and number 114 were actively engaged in offensive bombing operations. By May 1919, the tempo of these strikes had intensified to such an extent that nearly a ton of bombs were being dropped daily on Jalalabad. The Afghan forces had little effective response against this onslaught. One of the most striking episodes of the campaign occurred on 24th May 1919. RAF workshop personnel working under pressing circumstances had reassembled a Handley Page V 1500 heavy bomber named the Old Carthusian, the only aircraft of its kind in India at the time. Undertaking a demanding flight across the formidable Hindu Kush Mountains, the aircraft successfully carried out a bombing raid on Kabul, with several bombs landing within the precincts of Amir Amanullah's palace. The audacity and execution of this mission drew personal commendation from the Commander in Chief, General Sir Charles Munro. who formally acknowledged both the aircrew and the ground staff for their efforts. Even after the war, the conflict revealed another enduring dimension of the frontier challenge. The Amir had effectively leveraged tribal groups to harass and destabilize the British ground forces, and this tactic persisted even after the cessation of formal hostilities. With negotiations yielding little assurance of stability, British authorities remained convinced that the tribal threat would endure, reinforcing the necessity of a continued RAF presence in the region. General Monroe himself was deeply struck by the psychological impact of air power, noting the profound moral effect each sortie had upon the ground troops. While aerial bombardment proved of limited utility against dispersed tribal formations, as evidenced by the largely ineffective campaign against the Wazir tribe, the mere presence of aircraft overhead served as a powerful force multiplier, bolstering the morale of Indian troops while simultaneously undermining that of their adversaries. Taken together, the Third Afghan War and the subsequent Waziristan campaign signaled a decisive turning point, heralding the arrival of the aeroplane as a formidable and enduring factor in the conduct of frontier warfare. But the RAF was not confined solely to the frontier operations in India. A more troubling dimension of its employment emerged during this period, casting a shadow over its operational legacy. In 1919, as the unrest surrounding the Rowlatt Act intensified, coinciding with the ongoing Afghan conflict, British authorities increasingly turned to air power as a tool of domestic surveillance and suppression. So extensive was this diversion of resources that a significant portion of Number 114 Squadron was reassigned to riot control duties, leaving only two aircrafts to maintain its presence on the frontier. In the fraught aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the use of RAF escalated further. Aircrafts were deployed to disperse gatherings, and in Gujranwala, operations reached a particularly stark intensity. Major General Hugh Trenchard himself later rather disgustingly remarked upon these actions, noting with a degree of pride that RAF aircraft had dropped bombs and employed Lewis guns against protesters, releasing 8 bombs and firing over 800 rounds of ammunition in effort to quell the civil unrest. However, for all their deeply contentious and deplorable actions, these episodes were nevertheless leveraged to underscore the perceived utility of air power. In doing so, they reignited the calls for a more substantial air presence in India, culminating in a renewed demand for deployment of 6 fully equipped RAF squadrons, which was eventually granted. Underneath this projection of formidable strength, however, the reality was far more constrained. The capabilities of RAF in India during this period were in truth limited, both in scale and effectiveness. This disparity was actually acknowledged in a notable candor in a report issued by the Air Staff in August 1935, which offered a retrospective assessment of these early operations. In 1919 to 21, the aircrafts available in India were few in number, mostly primitive in type, and of low offensive power. The total offensive power of the aircraft employed in these early operations hardly exceeded one-tenth of the total striking power now available. In the air operations in Waziristan in 1919, the maximum scale of attack was 2 tons of bomb per day, or one half of the power of one modern squadron. And this scale was maintained for 5 days only. The aircraft themselves were far less reliable. Each aircraft flew in all for less than a third of the time flown in peace by an aircraft today. The report concluded with a telling observation as a testament to the adaptability of those involved. Under these difficulties, it is surprising that the aircrafts were able to achieve all that they did. Even as such assessments reflected on the material limitations of early air operations, a parallel shift was unfolding within the political landscape of India. The growing visibility of Indian aviators within the Royal Air Force, combined with an evolving discourse on self governance within India, began to influence how defense itself is perceived within the broader nationalist movement. Constitutional debates, committee deliberations, and official reports gradually began to acknowledge a fundamental premise that any vision of a self governing India would necessitate the establishment of its own military institutions, including an indigenous air force. These demands signaled a growing recognition that control over defense was inseparable from the idea of sovereignty and self rule. These demands did not emerge in our isolation. Rather, they were anchored in a broader transformation in how Indian leadership began to perceive their place within the empire in the aftermath of the First World War. India's contribution to the war effort had been extensive. Over a million Indian soldiers had served across multiple theaters, often under harsh conditions and unforgiving situations. For many, the service came at a devastating human cost. Thousands perished far from home on unfamiliar battlefields, frequently committed to the most exposed and perilous roles, including advancing into machine gun fire head on, while the command structures remained firmly in British hands. Such experiences deepened a growing sense of inequity, reinforcing the expectations that sacrifices of this magnitude must translate to greater responsibility, recognition, and representation within the military establishment itself. This evolving sentiment found partial acknowledgement in the Government of India Act of 1919, wherein the British government formally committed to increasing the association of Indians in every branch of administration and the gradual development of self governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India. Within this framework, the concept of Indianization of the armed forces began to gain traction, and it envisioned a gradual but meaningful integration of Indians into positions of command and responsibility within the subcontinent's military structure. Yet, such aspirations were met with resistance at the highest levels of colonial administration. The Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, remained firmly aligned with a more conservative school of thought and continued to view the role of Indians within the British military establishment through a lens of limitation and hierarchy. Sivaswamy Aiyer, widely regarded as a prominent moderate with a keen interest in military affairs, occupied a distinctive positions within the broader spectrum of the Indian freedom movement. He commanded support across ideological lines and was neither aligned with the more uncompromising stance of Congress militancy nor detached from the larger national cause. He represented a pragmatic and reformist voice advocating gradual but substantive change. It was in this capacity that he intervened during the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly, where the findings of the Escher Committee concerning the status and role of Indians within the armed forces were under consideration. On 28 March 1921, Aiyer successfully moved what would become a strongly worded and consequential resolution, titled Resolution Number 7. The resolution declared that the King Emperor's Indian subjects should be freely admitted to all arms of His Majesty's military, naval, and air forces in India, and the ancillary service and the auxiliary forces. That every encouragement should be given to Indians, including the educated middle class, subject to the prescribed standards of fitness to enter the commissioned ranks of the army. Furthermore, he demanded the creation of a military college such as Sandhurst to be kept in view in India. While the resolution was framed primarily to dismantle the institutional barriers that restricted Indians from obtaining King's Commission in the Indian Army, its implications extended further. Embedded within it was a broader assertion that similar restrictions governing recruitment into the Royal Air Force in India must also be lifted. These demands signaled an early and significant step towards the opening of aviation as a domain of opportunity for Indians. The waning confidence of Indian moderates in the British administration, coupled with the growing recognition of the need to offer tangible political concessions, compelled the British government to reconsider its earlier stance. In a departure from Lord Chelmsford's more rigid position, the British authorities began to accommodate the idea of Indians occupying positions of responsibility within the defense services. In this evolving policy framework, the Government of India further stipulated that Indians desiring commissions in the Royal Air Force should undergo the same training and receive the same education as British candidates for similar commissions. A provision that, at least in principle, placed Indian aspirants on an equal professional footing. Despite the shifting stance of British policy, the path towards meaningful Indianization of the Royal Air Force in India remained fraught with resistance and uncertainty. The momentum for reform had been set in motion, but its progress was uneven and was shaped by competing viewpoints within the establishment. It would take years of deliberation, negotiation, and gradual institutional adjustment before these efforts culminated in the formal drafting of the Air Force Act. In December of 1921, British Air Secretary Captain Frederick Guest advanced a set of proposals that sought to redefine the institutional standing of air power within India. He recommended that the air officer commanding the Royal Air Force in India be accorded the status of a secretary to the Government of India, thereby granting him direct access to the Viceroy on matters of defense. Equally significant was his suggestion that funds allocated for air purposes, including infrastructural works, be treated as distinct budgetary head rather than being remained subsumed under the army budget. These recommendations articulated an early and deliberate vision of an air force that would function with operational and financial autonomy, distinct from the traditional structures of the army. To assess the realities on ground and the possibility of implementing Captain Frederick's suggestions, Air Vice Marshal Sir John Salmond was dispatched to India in 1922. Their findings painted a stark and sobering picture. Salmond observed that the Royal Air Force in India was, for all intents and purposes, non existent as a fighting force. Although the authorized establishment provided for 70 aircrafts, of which at least 46 were expected to remain serviceable under varying climatic conditions, the actual state of affairs fell drastically short. As of 23rd August 1922, only 7 aircrafts, barely 15% of the expected strength, were deemed serviceable. Even among these, several were so aged and decrepit that they ought to have been withdrawn from service, while others continued to operate without essential technical equipment. The consequences of an air arm subsumed within and funded under the overarching dominance of the British Indian Army had by now become unmistakably evident. The limitations were visible in capability, preparedness, and institutional neglect. Even within the higher echelons of the British administration, Salmon's report was received as a stark warning, since it clearly exposed the inadequacies of the existing arrangement. The report also eventually led to sufficient funds being made available to ease the chronic supply problems that had hamstrung the RAF prior to 1923. Amidst these developments, a subtle but significant shift was also taking place in the political thinking. Secretary of State Edwin Montague, who had earlier approached the question with caution, began to reassess his position. The demonstrated utility of air power both in frontier warfare and in internal security operations was enough to make him reconsider his position in regards to the Air Force. In January 1922, Montague formally reiterated the Government of India's position, advocating that Indians be permitted to obtain commissions in the Air Force. He went further to assert that in the context of aviation, disabilities imposed on Indians purely on the basis of their origin ought to be removed altogether. This view found support among influential figures, including Austin Chamberlain and General Sir Claude Jacob, the Chief of the General Staff of the Indian Army. Yet, despite this convergence of opinion, the proposal encountered firm resistance within the British establishment. The notion of British airmen serving under Indian officers was deemed abhorrent, and it was widely believed that Indian officers may very well outright refuse to serve outside the Indian borders, thus creating a section in RAF that was capable of serving only in India. Even so, for the first time, the Air Council entertained the possibility of establishing an air service in India that would incorporate Indian personnel, thus envisioning the gradual emergence of a distinctively Indian air arm operating alongside and in support of the Royal Air Force. It was, however, made unequivocally clear that any such formation would remain subordinate to the Royal Air Force, and the training for the same will only be allowed at Royal Air Force Cadet College at Cranwell. Although these discussions were ultimately postponed, they formed the basis of the first manifestations of the arguments that would later lead to the creation of Indian Air Arm. Another important consideration for the British leadership was the question of the Air Force's practical utility, particularly as a substitute for conventional ground forces. Despite the proven success of Royal Air Force in 1918 to 1921, Commander-in-Chief Rawlinson was deeply skeptical. To him, the idea of replacing a field army unit with Air Force was utter madness. He argued that such a proposition lacked sufficient empirical validation. Circumstances, though, soon presented an opportunity to pursue such an experiment. In 1925, as unrest intensified once again along the northwest frontier province, a limited and deliberate experiment was carried out to allay Commander Rawlinson's fears. A contingent of 7 aircrafts drawn from number 1, number 5, and number 20 squadrons, equipped with Bristol fighters, along with number 27 and number 60 squadrons operating the DH-9A, was deployed under the command of Wing Commander Richard Pink to conduct operations against tribal elements in Waziristan. Notably, this campaign was executed without the support of ground forces, and significant operational constraints, including a shortage of experienced pilots and persistent engine reliability issues. Commander Pink nonetheless sustained an intense tempo of operations, logging around 2,000 flying hours over a span of just 54 days. Daylight bombing raids were complemented by nocturnal air blockade missions, and Commander Pink continuously varied his tactics to preserve the element of unpredictability. Overall, only a single DH-9A aircraft was brought down by the enemy fire, with both pilots and observer being killed in action. This air operation, undertaken solely by the Air Force, became a striking tribute to the power of the air. The sustained operational success of the Royal Air Force in India throughout the early 1920s reinforced confidence within the British establishment, prompting a further consolidation of its aerial presence. In line with the early recommendations put forth by Sir John Salmond, two additional squadrons, number 11 and number 39, were dispatched towards the close of 1928, bringing the total strength of the Royal Air Force in India to 8 squadrons. Number 11 Squadron brought with it the Westland Wapiti, the first aircraft to be designed specifically for air control operations. Over the course of the 1930s, the Wapiti would come to embody the RAF's presence in India, its name becoming synonymous with over a decade of arduous and unrelenting service across the subcontinent's most challenging theaters. Parallel to these developments during the 1920s, pressure continued to mount for the creation of an Indian equivalent of the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. The Sandhurst Committee of 1925, constituted under the chairmanship of General Andrew Skene, was tasked with examining the feasibility and desirability of establishing a military college in India for the training of Indians for commissioned ranks. Reflecting the political significance of the issue, the committee included prominent Indian leaders such as Pandit Motilal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, lending it the credibility necessary for acceptance by Indians. In its conclusions, the committee adopted a notably progressive stance for its time, endorsing the induction of Indians into commissioned ranks and advocating the establishment of an Indian military college. Importantly, it also acknowledged the contributions of Indian personnel within the Royal Air Force during the First World War, making specific references to figures such as Lieutenant Indra Roy and his award of the Distinguished Flying Cross, as well as honoring those Indian flying officers who had lost their lives in service. As a practical step towards integrating Indians into military aviation, the committee recommended that beginning in 1928, two positions be reserved annually for Indian cadets at the RAF College at Cranwell, with a view to gradually increasing this number over time. The idea was to lay the groundwork for future cadre of Indian trained officers. Air Vice Marshal Sir Geoffrey Salmond emerged as a firm and vocal critic of the Skene Committee's recommendations, particularly those pertaining to the Royal Air Force. He regarded such proposals as exceeding the committee's mandate. He argued that these recommendations lay outside the bounds of the committee's intended scope, which was to be focused on the British Indian Army and the Royal Military College in India. More fundamentally, Sir Salmond remained opposed to the direct integration of Indians into the RAF itself. Instead, he proposed an alternative vision where Indians would indeed be commissioned, but with the explicit objective of forming a distinct air unit within India rather than being absorbed into the existing Royal Air Force structure. Elaborating on this approach, Sir Salmond outlined a phased and carefully controlled model for the creation of what might eventually become the first Indian air unit. The process, as he conceived it, would begin with the establishment of a squadron under the guidance of a cadre of British personnel responsible for training and operational development. As Indian officers and airmen gradually acquired the required experience, this British presence would be systematically reduced until the unit evolved into a fully Indian formation. To support this transition, he proposed that Indian cadets be trained at RF College at Cranwell at a rate of 2 per year, with the squadron expected to begin forming 5 years after the first cadets commenced training and to reach full operational strength approximately 14 years thereafter. All this while, Sir Salmond was careful to emphasize that his recommendations were not intended as a blueprint for the immediate creation of an independent Indian Air Force. He clarified that they were just a measured response to the implications of the Skene Committee's report, which had gone beyond its mandate. The realities of the time, however, would soon outpace such caution. The shifting political climate in both India and Britain, coupled with mounting pressure for greater Indian participation in defense, accelerated the very process he had sought to control. In time, these incremental proposals would contribute directly to the emergence of an Indian Air Force in its modern form. In a significant development, the Secretary of State for India, Lord Birkenhead, through Military Dispatch Number 6, dated April 5, 1928, conveyed his approval in principle to the creation of an Indian Air Force, marking one of the earliest official endorsements of the concept at the highest level of governance. Meanwhile, the demand for Indianization was being articulated with increasing clarity and conviction within the Indian political sphere. One of the clearest articulations of this demand for Indianization appeared in the Nehru Report of 1928, chaired by Motilal Nehru. While primarily framed as a constitutional document, the report had an understated premise. Any future self governing India must exercise control over its own defense apparatus, encompassing the army, navy, and the air force alike. This view resonated across the broader nationalist leadership. Figures such as C.R. Das and Subhash Chandra Bose similarly regarded defense autonomy as inseparable from the idea of self rule. Jawaharlal Nehru, in his proclamation of Purna Swaraj at the Lahore session of the Congress, echoed this sentiment, implicitly asserting the necessity of complete Indian control over all three military services. In his writings and speeches of the period, he repeatedly emphasized that political independence without corresponding authority over defense would remain inherently incomplete. Consequently, the concept of Indianization within the subcontinent's military establishment continued to gain intellectual and political traction. By the early 1930s, this evolving discourse had begun to influence British opinion as well. Attitudes within sections of the administration grew more receptive, shaped in part by the demonstrated loyalty and effectiveness of the Indian forces. The Secretary of State Wedgwood Ben had expressed his appreciation for the Indian Army, while Lieutenant Commander Joseph Kenworthy advanced arguments in favor of an Indianized air arm. Commander Kenworthy, in particular, held the view that such a force, when combined with the mechanized elements of the British Indian Army, can become a prominent means of addressing the diverse security challenges within India. He also recognized, with notable foresight, the broader strategic and economic potential of civil aviation in the subcontinent. In time, these converging strands of policy, politics, and operational experiences culminated in a decisive and legislative leap. The Government of India enacted the Air Force Act in 1932, and upon receiving assent from the British government, it came into force, providing for the first time a formal legal foundation for the establishment of an Air Force in India. The act enabled the raising of what would become the Royal Indian Air Force, while also bringing India into alignment with other dominions that had already developed structure and institutionalized air services. Yet, for all its significance, the act reflected only a cautious and tightly controlled vision of Indianization. Opportunities for Indians within the commissioned ranks remained limited, and in its formative years, the service continued to be dominated by officers of the Royal Air Force. As has often been observed, the Indian Air Force Act of 1932 did not give rise to an independent air force in any immediate sense. Rather, it established a framework that opened the doors of aviation to Indians, but within a system that remained fully under British oversight. It was within this carefully structured framework that the first tangible step was taken. In 1932, Number 1 Squadron of the Indian Air Force was formed, comprising an initial cadre of six flying officers, marking the modest yet momentous beginning of India's own journey in military aviation.